Hi everyone, welcome back to Novel Nomad and welcome to my Adelaide Writers Week for 2020 wrap up. So I had an absolutely amazing time this year. It was so good. The topic was being human. I've done my TBR, so you got to see some of the books of the authors that were coming that I read, and so unfortunately some of the authors who I did read did cancel, but it doesn't mean there weren't plenty of others that I just absolutely adored. So this is actually going to be more of a book haul than a full wrap up. First off, let's go through the books that I did receive at Adelaide Writers Week, and that is including the Books to Grammar event that we held beforehand, which many lovely publishers actually donated books for us to read and review. So first off, we actually did a blind date with a book, and I got a copy of Jasper Jones by Greg Silverley. Now, I am so darn excited to read this book because it's just an Australian classic. It's won many awards and I've never read it. I've never even contemplated reading it. I've always seen it and I've always been utterly fascinated by it, but I've never picked it up myself. So I finally have a copy. I'm finally going to read it and I'm so excited to get the opportunity to do so. Next, from Allen and Unwin, I received a copy of A Murder at Malabar Hill. This is by Sunjata Massey. This is actually a bit of a cozy murder mystery, so I'm thinking of holding this one off until December. I know it's quite a long way away, so I think this is going to be quite a good one to save until then. I know the second book is also coming out this year, so stay tuned for that. But yeah, it looks like a really cute cozy mystery set in India, of course. So from Text Publishing, I received a copy of Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson. Now, I have to admit, I am thoroughly intrigued because I've heard wonderful things about this book, but it follows on from two friends who are friends at boarding school. One left for mysterious reasons of a scandal, and then the other one who stays at the boarding school. When she's older, she has twin stepkids, and when they have a tantrum, they actually combust, so they actually have flames all over their body. So I'm not sure what to entirely expect of this one. I think it's going to be a really fascinating read, but I do love this cover, so I was quite excited to nab a copy of this one. The rest are from the absolutely lovely publishing house Hachette, and the first one is The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abby Dare. I've heard amazing things about this, and it's about educating women in third world countries, so that is always an amazing thing, and being so close to International Women's Day, I think this is perfect timing for this one to be released. Next is a copy of The Paris Library by Janet Skellison Charles. So this is actually about the American Library in Paris, which opened up in 1920, and on the onset of war, especially when Paris was occupied by the Germans during World War II, they thought they'd have to close their doors, but they surprised everyone by being quite a centre of resistance, but also keeping fairly off the grid as well. So I think this is going to be an excellent World War II historical fiction. I do love a historical fiction, so this one is coming out in June, so I get to have a bit of an extra early copy of this one, and I do love World War II historical fiction, so I think I'm going to have a good time comparing it to all my other favourites. Next is a copy of How Much of These Hills is Gold by C. Pam Zhang. This is, I think it's just been released. It's a Virago Press edition, but that's Hachette in Australia. And this is really interesting. It's like the gold rush era in America, but it's following two twins of a migrant family from China, and they're basically traveling across the country to bury their father. And it just sounds brilliant. I do love this cover. I do love the US cover as well, but I think this cover just has a little bit more oomph. But yeah, so this one sounds amazing. It's like really intense apparently, so I was just so excited to get my hands on a copy. And lastly, I've got a copy of Kokomo by Victoria Hannon. This is actually the Victorian Premier's Literary Award unpublished manuscript copy, and what's really interesting about this one is it's about a girl who's living away from home, and she gets a call from her friends back in Melbourne to say that her agoraphobic mother, who's basically lived within the house, has too scared to go outside, has left the house for the first time in 12 years. So she rushes back to be with her mother, but she is desperate to understand the reason why her mother had finally left the house, and it apparently is very heartbreaking but also really heartwarming at the same time, so that's a good combo. But yeah, so this one sounds really emotionally moving, and it is out in, my goodness, when's it out? August, so plenty of time to look into this one before it comes out in August this year. Okay, let's go through the things I purchased at the Adelaide Writers Week book tent. I'm trying not to drop the pile of books I have here. I wouldn't say I went nuts. I just was very liberal with my spending money that I saved up for the event. So first off, I got a whole range of John Boyne's, mainly because these editions are super duper hard to find, and they've done them so they match the Ladder to the Sky. And so I thought all these pretty spines would look lovely on the shelf. And then I've also got a copy, let me see if I can put them down without dropping them. Okay, so then I've also got a copy of You Stay Where You Are Then Leave. This, I already do have this one, but this is an edition published especially for the Imperial War Museum in London. And I do love when they do special editions, and it's such a beautiful, beautiful illustrated book. So once again, probably can add this to my middle grade March reads. But yeah, so this is lovely, and I just had to pick this copy up. So next, probably one of my last purchases for Adelaide Writers Week was Jo Harjo, How We Became Human. This is a selection of all her different works throughout the years, and she is the Poet Laureate for the United States. And I had the great privilege to listen to her read out some of her poetry, and I fell in love. Each poem she presented differently. It's a different message behind each one, but the mastery of language that she used in each one was absolutely stunning. So I wanted to get something that really encompassed a lot of her work in one book, because obviously with poetry collections it's lovely to collect all of them, but they can get quite expensive. So I picked up this copy, and it was just amazing. She is a First Nations or Indigenous American, and her use of language in relation to the injustices is beyond beautiful. It really resonated with many of the Indigenous Australian poetry I've listened to and read lately, which is also excellent. So I just really wanted to get a collection to be as a memory of the time I listened to her speak. Next was Lucia Osborne Crowley, I Choose Elena. This was in relation to reclaiming and the voice and power. So both Lucia and Bree Lee, who were at that particular session, had actually suffered from domestic abuse, and they basically talked about their trauma and their journey back. And this is a really tiny little book, but apparently it's incredibly powerful. It is like an essay instead of a straight up memoir, and apparently it's just brilliant. So I am very, very, very keen to get into this one. She spoke so eloquently and beautifully, and there was so much emotion within their stories and so much truth about what we need to do to change, because both Bree Lee and Lucia have gone into law since they suffered that domestic abuse, and they're making moves to change the law within Australia. So that's always very encouraging to hear as well. Next, I finally picked up a copy of The Hate Race by Maxine Benova Clark. She did sign this for me as well, but I've already read this one, and I read it, I borrowed someone else's copy, so I finally got my own copy. But yeah, it's a stunning book. I do highly recommend. It's Maxine's memoir of growing up as a African Australian in Australia and Sydney in the 80s and 90s, and it's so good. So good. Next, I heard Wai Chim speak, and she was really, really lovely. I do have her other book, which is The Surprising Power of a Good Dumpling, which is really adorably cute. But this one is the first YA book that she did, called Freedom Swimmer, and it's about these two boys who want to get freedom and a life outside the one that they're expected to lead. Next, I finally found a copy of Tara June Winch, Swallow the Air. I do have her two other books. This was surprisingly a tiny little hardback. I was not expecting that. But I did read this from a library edition, which was paperback, and it was incredibly good. It's like a vignette of it's almost like short stories, but it's a vignette of one girl's experience of growing up disconnected from country and Indigenous young woman in Australia, and then her journey to find her place in country, which was beautiful. I really thoroughly loved it. The session for Sanam here, A Woman Like Her, was, unfortunately, I didn't really enjoy the moderator. I think the moderator wasn't really the right fit for the interview, and there was a lot of questioning of social media and basically saying it's incredibly toxic and not really looking at what Quandil Balok did in many ways for Pakistani women. It's also talking about her life and her death, of course. And it was just such a fascinating session, and it's really interesting to see where this interplay of social media and this kind of Western idea of feeding into social media linked into Pakistan. And lastly, one of my favourite sessions, because she was just absolutely fabulous to listen to. She was so hilarious. And that was Long Litwoon and The Way Through the Woods. This is about mushrooming and mourning. So Litwoon, she lost her husband of 32 years as they were living in Norway together. As she was struggling through the grief from the loss of her husband, she also had incredible loneliness, and so she decided to do something for herself, something that she was really interested in, and she'd always been interested in mushrooms. So she decided to join a mushroom course to learn about how to gather mushrooms and just to understand mushrooms further. And what started off was a bit of a self journey. So as she was writing this book, she was mainly writing about mushrooms, but then she realized that her story about her husband was so inextricably linked into this story as well. So she did dual stories. So you have green and black text throughout the book. So the green is the story about her husband, and the black is a story about the mushrooms. And she was just so fabulous to listen to. This really quirky, hilarious individual woman, and just about her struggles in her life to overcome this horrendous loss. And it was so funny. One of my favourite quotes from the actual event was when she was explaining about porcini mushrooms and how rare they are to find. And she's like, you don't just show anyone your porcini spots. It was just so dryly delivered, and it was just fabulous. So I cannot wait to get into this one, as I do love a book on grief and memoir, but I also love mushrooms as well. So that is my ridiculous book haul / wrap up for Adelaide Rise Week 2020. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed my little snippy vlog that I did for it. It's only quite short, so it won't take you 2 seconds to watch it. And I'll see you all next time. If you have read any of these books, or you want to get my thoughts on any of them in particular, let me know down below, and happy reading. Bye.